once you suddenly have these two different versions of the long run aggregate supply curves, things can get confusing. And I'm often asked by my students as to which of these two aggregate supply curves you have to memorize and which of these two versions of the model you have to use. And my answer to that is that you can use either of the two. They are not very different, as I said. In most part, Keynesians and monetarists agree, and as I said, most of the Keynesian objections are answered just through using this monetarist version of this graph. It's just this question of, will the aggregate demand always cause an increase in price level? That is the only thing to answer which Keynes had to come up with this fancy looking aggregate supply curve. And I will now end up this video by summarizing for you how these two models can show you almost exactly the same things, and through that explanation I will summarize this entire model of ADAS and the equivalence of these two different versions, and how you can think about most of the ideas either through this monetarist approach or through this Keynesian aggregate supply. And let me now summarize those things over here. So you see, as far as first of all the short-run equilibrium is concerned, we said the economy can be at potential, below potential, or above potential. Now we can depict all of these three situations either through the monetarist version or the Keynesian version. So to show that through a monetarist version, we'll just draw an aggregate demand and a short-run aggregate supply curve, and we will assume that this equilibrium GDP is also the potential output of the country. As simple as that. And through this potential output will then pass this long run aggregate supply curve. Now if we want to depict the same situation using the Keynesian version, we'll just draw this other more fancy sort of this aggregate supply curve, which has three sections: a flat section, then an upward sloping section, and then a steep vertical section. And I am trying to make it as well as I can. And if this is your potential output on this graph, then you can just sort of draw an aggregate demand curve that passes through this point, and that would depict the same situation, that the economy is producing an output which is equal to its potential output. Then the other short-run equilibrium possibility is when your short-run equilibrium GDP is less than your potential GDP. This is how we show it on this monetarist graph. We can show the same on this Keynesian graph. Again, we will have to first of all draw this Keynesian aggregate supply curve. We will assume that this is the potential output, and slightly above potential your aggregate supply curve is straight vertical line. You can't produce much more than your potential. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I could have drawn this potential output somewhere over here or somewhere over here, so let's just keep it over here. It doesn't really matter. All we are trying to show here is a situation such as this. So you can draw your aggregate demand curve anywhere so that your intersection of AS and AD happens to be below your potential. So the shape of aggregate supply curve is slightly different, but the idea in terms of the equilibrium is where the aggregate demand crosses the aggregate supply, that of course remains the same. And then the third situation where your short run equilibrium is more than your potential output. This is how we show that in our monetarist version. In our Keynesian version, all we need to do is mark out the potential output somewhere over here, and then just make sure you draw an aggregate demand that gives you an equilibrium that happens to be more than your potential output. So you can depict all of these three different situations either through the monetarist or the Keynesian versions. Now, in terms of what we learned about how these different factors such as money supply, income tax, interest rate, etc., how they can shift your aggregate demand curve, and therefore how you can work out the new equilibrium, those ideas remain the same whether you are using this monetarist or Keynesian version. So for instance, let's say starting from this position where the short-run GDP is equal to potential GDP. If your aggregate demand curve increases, then the monetarist version, you can use that to work out that in this economy, as the aggregate demand increases, the equilibrium will move to this point, at which point the GDP will increase and the price levels will increase. Now you can do the same analysis in this Keynesian version. So start off at your potential GDP, increase your aggregate demand, and this graph will also show you that look, your aggregate demand, your GDP will increase, whereas your price levels will increase as well. So you can use either version of this graph to think about the shifts of the aggregate demand and how the macroeconomy and the key indicators change as the aggregate demand shifts. Now you can show the shifts of aggregate supply in either of these graphs again. So if you have to shift aggregate supply to the left, again start off always by assuming an initial equilibrium GDP and price level, and shift the aggregate supply to the left, and you can figure out from this graph that the GDP will fall and the price levels will increase. Now you can show the shifts of aggregate supply through this Keynesian version as well, but I mean, in terms of drawing it, it gets a bit more messy, but you can show it over here. So if aggregate supply falls, you can just sort of build it like this. So potential is the same, and you will get the same result. Aggregate supply has shifted to the left, so GDP has fallen and the price levels have increased. So this is where I'm saying that look, these graphs, these models, they look very different and they can sort of scare you, but they are basically the same thing. They show you the different short-run equilibrium positions. They are a tool which you can use to work out how the macroeconomic conditions or indicators change when AD or AS change. And then also remember that overall the long-term message of both of these Keynesians and monetarists is that you should focus upon increasing the potential output of the country. In this monetarist version, that would mean the LR to AS would shift somewhere over here to the right, and then the economy will then start fluctuating around this much higher level of GDP. In the the Keynesian version, to depict the same thing, we can just shift the aggregate supply curve somewhere over here to the right, and you can see the same thing, that look, given aggregate demand also follows, your economy will move to a much higher level of GDP. So again, you can see that these models are, most of the things they have to say are the same. The difference, the fundamental theoretical difference, the difference in the message of monetarist Keynesians, the reason why these two different versions exist is that these monetarists insisted that if you are in a recessionary gap like this, where your GDP is less than potential, monetarists said that look, eventually the wages will fall, and as wages fall and get unstuck, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right and your economy will come back to its potential. The Keynesians disagree. They said that look, if you are below your potential GDP, there won't be any automatic self-correction. This is your aggregate supply. Forget about short run versus long run. If you don't have enough aggregate demand, your economy will be stuck at this point. So the way out is try to increase this aggregate demand, take the economy back to potential. The same idea can be depicted here. Don't stay here and wait for the automatic self-correction and shift right of the SRAS. Try to get your aggregate demand back to the right so that you can move back to potential. This self-correction, this increase in short-run aggregate supply won't take place according to Keynes, because wages, they won't fall even in the long run. And then the second key difference is that these monetarists, they said that okay, if you increase your aggregate demand to get back to potential, that would always create inflation. Keynes' answer was that no, look at my aggregate supply. If you are much below potential and then increase your aggregate demand, only output or GDP will increase and price levels won't increase a lot. But yes, if you are closer to your potential, then aggregate demand increases, then your GDP will increase, but your price levels will also increase. Whereas if you are already at your potential and then your aggregate demand increases, then yes, it's basically the price level that will increase and GDP won't change much at all. So you can think of the Keynes message as being that look, you can play with aggregate demand. You should play with aggregate demand to try and push your economy back to its potential. But it's not a policy that can be overused, because once you are at your potential, then yes, it's the potential output that has to be increased. You can't just keep on increasing your aggregate demand, because beyond a certain point, that will only cause inflation. But if you are in a deep recession, then according to Keynes, it's very useful to push your aggregate demand to the right and get your economy back to its potential output.